I never meant for them to see the appraisal that night. It was supposed to remain safely locked in my jewelry box, a secret between my late grandmother and me. But as I sat at the Blackwood family's pristine dining table, listening to yet another thinly veiled insult about my quaint little ring, something inside me shifted. The weight of my grandmother's cashmere sapphire felt different against my finger. Not like a burden anymore, but like armor. Such a minimalist choice, Victoria Blackwood had just finished saying, her perfectly manicured fingers gesturing dismissively toward my hand. I suppose not everyone can appreciate the statement a proper diamond makes. The room hummed with barely contained laughter. My husband James shifted uncomfortably beside me, but said nothing. Again, just like he had said nothing 6 months ago when his sister Caroline suggested I upgrade my ring now that I'd married into the family. Just like he had said nothing when his mother first laid eyes on the simple platinum band and asked with practiced politeness if it was vintage. I smiled serenely and thanked Victoria for noticing the ring's simplicity. What I didn't tell her was that in my purse, nestled between my lipstick and car keys, lay a sealed envelope that would turn their world of assumptions upside down. Before we continue with Ava's story of quiet triumph, I want to pause for a moment. If you've ever felt judged for not conforming to others' expectations of wealth or status, this story will resonate deeply. Please consider subscribing. It's completely free and connects you with thousands who understand that true value isn't always visible on the surface. Now let's return to that fateful dinner where everything changed. The Blackwood family mansion sat like a monument to old money on Beacon Hill, its federal-style architecture commanding respect from every angle. I'd been coming to these monthly family dinners for 8 months now, ever since James and I married in what his mother diplomatically called an intimate ceremony. Translation, too small, too simple, too middle class for their taste. Tonight felt different, though. Perhaps it was the way Victoria had made a point of showing off her new tennis bracelet. An early anniversary gift from Charles, she'd announced, making sure everyone noticed the way it caught the chandelier light. Or maybe it was how Caroline had spent the cocktail hour discussing her latest jewelry acquisition, a vintage Cartier watch that had belonged to some European countess. I touched my ring unconsciously, the smooth platinum warm against my skin. They saw simplicity. I saw my grandmother's final gift, chosen with a love that transcended monetary value. Though, as it turned out, the monetary value was rather significant too. The dinner proceeded with its usual choreography. James's father, Harrison, held court at the head of the mahogany table, regaling us with stories from his latest business acquisition. His wife, Patricia, orchestrated the conversation with the precision of a conductor, ensuring each family member had their moment to shine. The crystal gleamed, the wine flowed, and the subtle barbs flew with practiced ease. "Ava, darling," Patricia said as the salad course was cleared, "I've been meaning to ask about your jewelry insurance. Such an important consideration for newlyweds." I smiled politely. "Thank you for thinking of it, Patricia. I've actually just had everything appraised." "How responsible," Victoria chimed in, not bothering to hide her smirk. "Though I imagine it's quite affordable to insure more modest pieces." The comment hung in the air, like expensive perfume, overwhelming and impossible to ignore. I watched James's jaw tighten, but he remained silent, cutting his lamb with unnecessary precision. My heart ached for him, caught between his family's expectations and his wife's dignity. But tonight wasn't about his comfort. Tonight was about truth. "You're absolutely right," I agreed, taking a sip of wine. "Modest is exactly how I'd describe it." Caroline leaned forward, sensing blood in the water. "I hope you don't mind me saying, but when I first saw your ring, I thought perhaps it was a placeholder, until James could afford something more substantial." The silence that followed was deafening. Every family member's attention focused on my left hand, where my grandmother's ring sat quietly, unassuming in its platinum setting. To them, it looked like exactly what Caroline suggested: a temporary solution, a compromise born of financial necessity. I set down my wine glass with deliberate care. It's interesting that you mentioned that, Caroline. I actually brought something tonight that might clarify things. From my purse, I withdrew the envelope I'd carried like a talisman all evening. The cream-colored paper felt substantial between my fingers, official and final. This arrived yesterday from Whitmore and Associates. They're the premier jewelry appraisers in Boston. Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly. Even she recognized the name. Whitmore had been appraising jewelry for Boston's elite families for over a century. The insurance company required a certified appraisal, I continued, my voice steady despite the electricity I felt building in the room. I thought you might find it illuminating. I handed the envelope to Harrison, who sat closest to me. As the family patriarch, he commanded a certain respect, even from his children. His fingers, steady despite his 73 years, broke the seal with practiced ease. The room held its collective breath as he withdrew the official letterhead and began to read. I watched his expression change, from polite interest to confusion to something approaching shock. His reading glasses slipped slightly down his nose as he leaned forward, studying the document more closely. "This can't be right," he murmured, more to himself than to the room. "What is it, darling?" Patricia asked, concern creeping into her voice. Harrison looked up at me, then back at the appraisal, then at me again. "It says here that this ring contains a rare cashmere sapphire, approximately 3.2 carats, with exceptional clarity and color saturation." Victoria's fork clattered against her plate. "Cashmere sapphire?" "The estimated value," Harrison continued, his voice gaining strength, "is $2 million. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was a vacuum, as if the very air had been sucked from the room. I watched the color drain from Victoria's face, saw Caroline's mouth open and close without producing sound, witnessed Patricia's careful composure crack like fine porcelain. James turned to stare at me, his expression a mixture of amazement and something that might have been pride. "Ava, you never told me." "My grandmother's final gift," I said simply, extending my hand so they could all see the ring with new eyes. "She left specific instructions that it should never leave the family. She said true treasures hide in plain sight." Harrison passed the appraisal to Patricia, who read it with the intensity of someone decoding a foreign language. Her hands trembled slightly as she set it down on the table. "A cashmere sapphire?" she repeated slowly. "Do you realize how rare these are?" I nodded. The appraiser explained that cashmere sapphires are among the most precious gemstones in the world. The mines were exhausted over a century ago, making existing stones incredibly valuable. This particular stone has what they call cornflower blue coloration, apparently quite desirable. Victoria reached for the appraisal with shaking fingers. As she read, her earlier smugness evaporated entirely. It's certified by the Gemological Institute of America and Gubelin. This is legitimate." "Of course it's legitimate," I replied calmly. "My grandmother would never have given me anything false." Caroline's voice came out as barely a whisper. $2 million? The appraisal notes that similar stones have sold at auction for even higher amounts. Apparently, the market for rare cashmere sapphires is quite robust. The room erupted in a chaos of whispered conversations. Harrison leaned over to examine the ring more closely, his businessman's eye now seeing an investment rather than a simple band. Patricia fanned herself with her napkin, whether from shock or embarrassment, I couldn't tell. Victoria and Caroline huddled together, frantically whispering about gemstone markets and auction houses. Through it all, James sat beside me in stunned silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with wonder. "Ava, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell any of us?" I turned to face him fully, This man I'd married despite his family's subtle disapproval, despite their assumption that I was somehow beneath their notice. Because the value was never the point, James. This ring represents my grandmother's love, her wisdom, her belief that the most precious things in life are often overlooked by those who only see surface appearances. My words carried a weight that settled over the dining room like a heavy curtain. Patricia's face flushed pink, whether from shame or anger, I couldn't determine. Victoria's tennis bracelet suddenly looked gaudy against her wrist. Caroline's vintage Cartier watch seemed almost pedestrian in comparison. I have to ask, Harrison said, his business instincts overriding his social embarrassment. Have you considered the investment implications? A piece like this in today's market. Actually, I interrupted gently, I've been considering donating it to charity. There's an organization that provides educational scholarships for underprivileged children. I thought perhaps auctioning the ring could fund several full scholarships. The intake of breath around the table was audible. Patricia's wineglass paused halfway to her lips. Victoria looked as though I'd suggested burning money. Carolyn gripped her napkin so tightly her knuckles went white. But after tonight, I continued, my voice taking on a steelier quality, I think I'll keep it instead, as a reminder. A reminder of what? Patricia asked, though something in her tone suggested she already knew. I stood slowly, my grandmother's ring catching the light from the chandelier in a way that seemed almost magical. For the first time that evening, I felt the full power of what I carried on my finger. Not just monetary value, but the weight of generations of strong women who had worn this stone before me. A reminder that true worth isn't always apparent to the naked eye, I said, looking directly at Victoria, and that making assumptions about people based on appearances can be illuminating. I gathered my purse and wrap with unhurried grace. Thank you for a lovely dinner, Patricia. The lamb was exceptional. Harrison rose beside me, his hand finding mine, the one wearing the $2 million ring his family had just finished mocking. He said, I'll drive you home. As we moved toward the door, I heard Victoria's voice behind us, sharp with desperation. Ava, wait! I think there might have been a misunderstanding. I paused in the doorway, turning back with a serene smile. No misunderstanding at all, Victoria. You've all been perfectly clear about your opinions regarding my ring. I simply thought you deserved to know exactly what you were critiquing. The drive home passed in contemplative silence. James gripped the steering wheel with unnecessary force, his jaw tight with emotions I couldn't quite read. Finally, as we pulled into our driveway, he spoke. I should have defended you, he said, his voice raw with regret. All those months of comments, all those little digs about your ring, about your family's background, about our simple wedding, I should have shut it down immediately. I turned to study his profile in the dim light from our porch. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with truths he'd been avoiding. Because part of me believed them, he admitted finally. Not about you, never about your worth as a person, but about the ring itself. I assumed it was modest. I thought maybe after I made partner at the firm, we could upgrade to something that would satisfy their expectations. The honesty stung, but I appreciated it. And now? Now, I realize that my family's expectations are the problem, not your ring, not your background, not any of the things they've been subtly criticizing since the day I brought you home. He turned to face me fully. I'm ashamed that it took a $2 million appraisal for me to see how toxic their behavior has been. I reached for his hand, intertwining our fingers. The money doesn't matter, James. What matters is that you see them clearly now. I do, he said firmly. And I see you clearly too. Your grandmother raised an extraordinary woman, and she gave you a ring that reflects that. Not because of its value, but because she recognized something precious in you that had nothing to do with money.
That night, as I prepared for bed, I stood before my vanity mirror and really looked at my grandmother's ring for the first time in months. The cashmere sapphire seemed to glow in the lamplight, its cornflower blue depths holding secrets and stories I was only beginning to understand. I thought about my grandmother, Eleanor Chen, who had immigrated to America with nothing but determination and a small silk pouch containing her mother's jewelry. She'd worked as a seamstress, saved every penny, and eventually opened her own dress shop. The ring had been her mother's, passed down through generations of strong women who understood that survival sometimes meant keeping your most valuable assets hidden. "Never let them see all your cards at once, little bird," she told me when she slipped the ring onto my finger just weeks before she died. "There's power in being underestimated." At the time, I thought she was being overly dramatic. Now I understood the wisdom in her words. The next morning brought an avalanche of texts and phone calls from the Blackwood family. Patricia's message arrived first. "Darling, I hope you'll forgive any misunderstanding from last night. Perhaps we could have lunch this week to discuss." I deleted it without finishing. Victoria's text was longer, more desperate. "Ava, I feel terrible about my comments regarding your ring. I had no idea of its significance, both personal and monetary. I'd love to make it up to you somehow. Perhaps we could go shopping together. I know the most wonderful jeweler who could create a proper setting to showcase such an important piece." Delete. Caroline's message was the most transparent. "I've been thinking about your charitable donation idea. As someone involved in several philanthropic organizations, I'd be happy to help you navigate the auction process. We should definitely discuss the tax implications." Delete. Only James's message made me smile. "Thank you for showing me what quiet strength looks like. I love you and your extraordinary ring." The story spread through Boston's social circles with the velocity of wildfire. By the end of the week, I'd received invitations to 3 charity galas, 2 museum fundraisers, and a private viewing at Sotheby's. Suddenly, everyone wanted to meet the woman with the multi-million-dollar cashmere sapphire who'd been hiding in plain sight. I declined them all. Instead, I spent my Saturday morning at the Children's Literacy Center where I volunteered, reading stories to wide-eyed 6-year-olds who couldn't care less about the ring on my finger. They were enchanted by the tale of a brave princess who defeated a dragon with kindness rather than a sword, a story that felt more relevant than ever. "Miss Ava," little Sophie asked as I closed the book, "is your ring magic?" I glanced down at the cashmere sapphire, thinking of my grandmother's wisdom, the strength it had given me to face down my husband's family, the power of truth revealed at precisely the right moment. "You know what, Sophie? I think it might be." That afternoon, I met Harrison for coffee, a meeting he'd requested through James with an urgency that surprised me. We sat in a quiet corner of the Four Seasons, surrounded by the understated luxury that seemed to follow the Blackwood family everywhere. "I owe you an apology," he began without preamble, "not just for last night, but for months of allowing my family to treat you as though you didn't belong." I stirred sugar into my tea, considering his words. "What changed your mind? The appraisal?" "Partly," he admitted with characteristic honesty, "but mostly the grace with which you handled yourself. You could have humiliated us completely. You had every right to. Instead, you made your point and left with dignity." Humiliation was never the goal. Understanding was. He leaned forward, his businessman's intensity focused entirely on me. "I've spent 40 years building the Blackwood reputation on the principle that worth is measured by visible success. Last night, you taught me that real worth often hides beneath the surface." My grandmother would have liked that observation. I would have liked to meet her. He paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. James told me about her background, her immigration story, how she built a business from nothing. That's exactly the kind of foundation our family was built on 3 generations ago. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that. I studied his weathered face, seeing genuine remorse in his eyes. "What are you saying, Harrison?" "He's saying that my wife, daughters, and son have been acting like exactly the kind of people my grandfather would have despised. Entitled, dismissive, valuing appearance over substance." He shook his head ruefully. "We've become everything our family originally fought against." The conversation continued for over an hour, touching on family dynamics, the corrupting influence of inherited wealth, and the importance of remaining grounded despite success. By the time we parted, I felt something had fundamentally shifted in my relationship with the Blackwood patriarch. The monthly family dinner the following week was a study of contrasts. Where once I had felt like an outsider tolerated for James's sake, now I was treated with a respect bordering on reverence. Patricia asked thoughtful questions about my grandmother's immigration experience. Caroline inquired about the literacy center where I volunteered. Patricia actually listened to my responses instead of waiting for her turn to speak.
The transformation felt surreal, like watching actors perform a play with a completely different script. "Have you given any more thought to the auction idea?" Patricia asked, as dessert was served. "I've done some research on charitable giving strategies, and there are some fascinating tax advantages." "I've decided to keep the ring," I interrupted gently but firmly. "For now." The disappointment around the table was palpable, though everyone tried to hide it. I could almost see them calculating the charity connections they could have made, the social capital they could have gained from being associated with such a generous donation. "Of course," Victoria said quickly. "It's a family heirloom, completely understandable." "Though," Caroline added hopefully, "if you ever change your mind about displaying it at the museum fundraiser." I smiled and changed the subject to the weather. On the drive home, James was unusually quiet. Finally, as we waited at a red light, he spoke. "They're trying," he said. "I know it feels calculated, but I think they're genuinely trying to make amends. I know they are, and I appreciate the effort, but I also recognize that their newfound respect is entirely based on the monetary value of my ring." Does that matter if the end result is better treatment? I considered his question carefully. The light turned green, and we continued through the quiet streets of our neighborhood, past the modest colonial homes that the Blackwood family had once subtly criticized as quaint. It matters because it means their respect is conditional, based on an external validation they can understand rather than an internal recognition of my worth as a person. James was quiet for several blocks. So what happens now? Now we see how long their good behavior lasts and whether they can learn to value substance over appearances, or if this is just a temporary adjustment to accommodate an asset they've newly discovered. The test came sooner than expected. 3 weeks later, James lost his biggest client at the law firm. The Hendersons, who had been with the practice for over a decade, decided to move their considerable business to a larger firm downtown. James had worked on their account for 5 years, and their departure was both a professional blow and a significant reduction in his billable hours. He came home that evening looking defeated, his usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. Over dinner, he explained the situation and its potential impact on his partnership track. "I might need to take a step back financially," he said, barely touching his food. "Maybe we should postpone the kitchen renovation. And the vacation to Italy." "James," I interrupted gently, "we'll be fine." "Will we? I know you're used to a certain lifestyle now, and if I can't provide—" "Stop." I reached across the table and took his hand. "Do you honestly think I care about kitchen renovations or Italian vacations?" He looked up at me with vulnerable eyes. "Sometimes I wonder if you'd be happier with someone who could give you more, someone who could provide the kind of luxury you deserve." The irony was stunning. Here was my husband worried about providing material wealth for a woman who wore a $2 million ring, expressing fears about inadequacy to someone who had grown up helping her grandmother count the day's earnings from a small dress shop. "James," I said softly, I fell in love with a man who made me laugh, who listened to my stories about difficult students with genuine interest, who brought me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings. I married you for who you are, not for what you could buy me. But my family. Your family's values are not my values, I said firmly. I grew up watching my grandmother build a successful business through hard work and determination. Money was important because it meant survival and independence, not because it bought status or approval. That weekend, I suggested we visit my childhood neighborhood, something I'd been reluctant to do since our marriage. I'd been afraid that James would see the modest homes and small businesses as somehow beneath him, or that his family's attitudes had infected him more than I'd realized. We drove through the streets where I'd grown up, past the corner market where I'd bought penny candy with my allowance, the park where my grandmother had taught me to tend the small community garden plot she'd rented for $5 a month. I showed him the storefront that had housed her dress shop, now a trendy cafe, but still bearing the elegant painted sign she'd commissioned when business was good. She was amazing, I said, as we stood before the window, watching young professionals sip expensive lattes where my grandmother had once pinned patterns and measured seams. He studied the building with new eyes. This is where you learned about quality. I corrected. This is where I learned about value. Real value. The difference between something beautiful and something expensive. Is that why you've never wanted to upgrade your ring, even before you knew its worth? I turned to face him fully. I never wanted to upgrade because it was never about the ring itself. It was about what it represented, my grandmother's love, her belief in me, her understanding that some gifts transcend monetary value. And now that you know its monetary value? Now, I understand that my grandmother was even wiser than I realized. She gave me something that would always be valuable in terms the world could understand, but she disguised it as something simple so I would never lose sight of what truly mattered. We walked hand in hand through the neighborhood streets, and I felt James beginning to understand not just where I'd come from, but why those origins had shaped me in ways that made his family's wealth seem almost trivial by comparison. The next monthly family dinner was scheduled for the weekend following James's client loss. I dreaded it, knowing that news of his professional setback would have reached the family through the efficient gossip network that connected all of Boston's legal community. I was right to be concerned. Such a shame about the Henderson account, Victoria said with false sympathy as we gathered for cocktails. I heard they moved to Blackstone and Associates. Didn't they take several other clients with them? James's jaw tightened, but he answered politely. Business decisions happen. We'll be fine. Of course you will, Caroline chimed in. Though I imagine it might affect your timeline for partnership? Caroline, Patricia warned, but her tone lacked real censure. I'm just saying, these setbacks can be costly, especially for couples who are accustomed to a certain lifestyle. Victoria's eyes drifted meaningfully to my ring. There it was, the test I'd been expecting. With James's earning potential temporarily in question, the family's focus shifted back to my ring and its considerable value. The subtext was clear. Perhaps now would be an appropriate time to liquidate some assets. Actually, Harrison said, entering the conversation with the authority of family patriarch, I've been thinking about Ava's donation idea. Given the current market conditions, it might be an excellent time to consider... No. The word came out sharper than I'd intended, cutting through the polite conversation like a blade. Every head turned toward me, surprise evident on their faces. I'm sorry, Patricia said, her perfectly modulated voice carrying just a hint of steel. I said no. I repeated, my voice steadier now, but no less firm. I will not be selling my grandmother's ring to offset James's temporary financial adjustment. Of course not, Victoria said quickly. We weren't suggesting... Yes, you were. I set down my wine glass and looked around the room, meeting each of their eyes in turn. The suggestion was about charitable giving, tax advantages, and social impact.
The suggestion was about liquidating an asset to solve a temporary problem, and I'm saying no. I stood, feeling the familiar weight of my grandmother's ring as a source of strength rather than burden. James and I will adjust our budget like any responsible couple facing a temporary reduction in income. We'll postpone the kitchen renovation, cancel the expensive vacation, eat out less frequently. We'll live within our means without selling irreplaceable family treasures. But the market value? The market value is irrelevant, I said firmly. This ring is not an investment portfolio to be adjusted based on market conditions. It's a family heirloom with sentimental value that far exceeds its monetary worth. Patricia recovered her composure enough to speak. Of course, dear. We completely understand the emotional attachment. We simply thought, you thought, that because James is experiencing a professional setback, I would be willing to sacrifice my grandmother's legacy to maintain appearances. I gathered my purse and wrap with deliberate calm. James stood beside me, his earlier uncertainty replaced with something that looked remarkably like pride. She's right, he said quietly. We don't need charity, and we certainly don't need to sell family heirlooms to maintain a lifestyle that was always unsustainable anyway. James, his father began. No, Dad. Ava is right about all of it. We've become so focused on appearances, on maintaining a certain image, that we've lost sight of what actually matters. Ava's grandmother built a business from nothing. She understood real value, real worth. Maybe it's time we remembered those lessons. As we moved toward the door, Victoria made one last attempt. Ava, please don't take this personally. We're family. We only want what's best. What's best is remembering that family supports each other through difficult times without demanding financial sacrifices. What's best is recognizing that a temporary setback doesn't require permanent solutions. I paused, feeling the weight of my grandmother's wisdom flowing through me as a source of strength rather than burden. What's best is understanding that some things in this world cannot and should not be reduced to their monetary value. The drive home was different this time. Instead of the tense silence that had followed previous family dinners, James and I talked, really talked, about money, values, and what we wanted our life to look like together. I've been thinking about your grandmother's dress shop, about the way she built something meaningful rather than just profitable. What about it? I've been so focused on making partner, on earning more money, on meeting my family's expectations, that I lost sight of why I became a lawyer in the first place. I wanted to help people. I wanted to use the law to solve problems and protect those who couldn't protect themselves. You still can, I said softly. Can I? The Henderson account represented everything I thought I wanted. High-profile clients, substantial fees, prestigious cases. But it wasn't fulfilling. It wasn't meaningful. So what would be meaningful? He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at our modest neighborhood with its small homes and matured trees. There's a legal aid clinic downtown that's been trying to recruit me for months. Pro bono work mostly, but also some paying clients who can't afford the big firms. That sounds perfect. It would mean less money, significantly less money. We'd need to adjust our lifestyle permanently, not just temporarily. I reached for his hand and intertwining our fingers. James, I grew up on my grandmother's earnings from a small dress shop. I know how to live well on less money. The question is whether you're ready to prioritize meaning over income. I think I am. But are you? Really? You've gotten used to the dinner parties, the luxury vacations, the status symbols my family expects. Have I? I challenged gently. Have you seen me enjoy those dinner parties? Have I ever expressed enthusiasm for expensive vacations or status symbols? He considered this, recognition dawning in his eyes. You've been accommodating my family's expectations, not pursuing your own desires. Exactly. And now you know what I actually value. Authenticity, meaningful work, genuine relationships, none of which require substantial income. That night, we made a list of what our life could look like if James took the legal aid position. A smaller house, maybe, but one we could truly afford. Vacations that prioritize experience over luxury. Dinner parties with friends who valued conversation over appearances.
It sounded perfect. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Patricia Blackwood stood on our doorstep at 9 o'clock, dressed in her usual understated elegance, but looking somehow smaller than I'd ever seen her. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," she said when I opened the door. I felt I owed you a personal apology. I invited her in, curious about what had prompted this unusual visit. Patricia rarely ventured outside her carefully controlled social circle, and she'd certainly never appeared at our house unannounced. We sat in our modest living room, and I could see her taking in the space with new eyes. The books on psychology and education that filled our shelves, the framed photos of my grandmother and me, the comfortable furniture that prioritized function over fashion. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," she began, her usually perfect composure showing cracks. "About families supporting each other without demanding financial sacrifices. And? And I realized that we've become exactly the kind of people I swore I'd never become when Harrison and I were young and struggling." She smoothed her skirt with nervous hands. "My father was a plumber, Ava. A good one, but still a working-class man who saved every penny to send me to college." This revelation surprised me. In all the months I'd known Patricia, she'd never mentioned her background, allowing me to assume she'd been born into the wealth she now inhabited so comfortably. "I met Harrison when I was working as a secretary at his father's law firm. I was 22, wearing my one good dress to work every day, eating peanut butter sandwiches for lunch because I couldn't afford the cafe downstairs. What changed? Harrison's family accepted me eventually, but only after I proved I could adapt to their social expectations. I learned to dress appropriately, speak properly, entertain graciously. I became the perfect lawyer's wife." She paused, pain evident in her voice. "But somewhere along the way, I forgot where I came from. I forgot what it felt like to be judged for not having enough." "Is that why you've been so critical of my background?" She nodded slowly. "I think I was protecting myself by creating distance from anything that reminded me of my own humble beginnings. When I saw your simple ring, your modest wedding, your middle-class background, it triggered every insecurity I'd spent 30 years trying to bury." The honesty was unexpected and deeply moving. I could see the courage it took for Patricia to admit these truths, to acknowledge the ways she'd perpetuated the same class discrimination she'd once experienced. "What made you realize this?" "Watching you last night, the dignity with which you refused to compromise your values, even under pressure. The clarity with which you articulated what truly matters." She met my eyes directly. "You reminded me of who I used to be, before I decided that fitting in was more important than staying true to myself." We talked for another hour, and I began to understand the complex family dynamics that had shaped James's upbringing. Patricia's determination to shield her children from the class discrimination she'd experienced had inadvertently created an environment where they felt entitled to discriminate against others. "I want to do better," she said as she prepared to leave. "Not just with you, but with how we approach money and status and what we teach the next generation." "What does that look like?" "I'm not sure yet, but I think it starts with acknowledging that we've been valuing the wrong things and that you've been trying to teach us better ways without us being wise enough to listen." After she left, I sat in my quiet living room thinking about the unexpected connections between her story and my grandmother's. Two women who had started with very little, worked hard to build better lives, but chose dramatically different paths once they achieved success. My grandmother had remained grounded in her values, using her success to help others while never forgetting her struggles.
Patricia had used her success to distance herself from her origins, creating barriers that ultimately isolated her family from authentic relationships. The ring on my finger felt heavier that day, weighted not just with monetary value, but with the responsibility of carrying forward my grandmother's wisdom in a family that was just beginning to understand its importance. James came home that evening with news. He'd met with the legal aid clinic and accepted their offer. His starting salary would be less than half what he'd been earning, but his eyes held a light I hadn't seen in months. "I forgot how good it feels to do meaningful work," he said, pulling me into his arms. "Today, I helped a family keep their home, Ava. I used my education and skills to solve a real problem for people who genuinely needed help."
How did your family take the news? About as well as you'd expect. Dad thinks I'm making a mistake. Mom is worried about our financial future. Victoria called it a noble phase that I'll grow out of. And how do you feel about their reaction? Free, he said without hesitation. For the first time in years, I feel free to make choices based on what I think is right, rather than what they think is appropriate. That night, as we planned our new budget and discussed the changes we'd need to make, I felt a contentment I hadn't experienced since our wedding day. We were finally building a life based on our values rather than others' expectations. The transition wasn't without challenges. We sold James's expensive car and bought a reliable used model. We canceled our country club membership and found a community recreation center instead. We learned to cook more meals at home and discovered that we actually enjoyed the time together in the kitchen. Most significantly, we moved. Our suburban colonial was larger than we needed and carried a mortgage that consumed too much of our reduced income. We found a charming townhouse in the same neighborhood where I'd grown up, walking distance from my grandmother's old shop, and surrounded by the kind of community we'd been missing. The moving day was particularly symbolic. As I packed my grandmother's ring in its special box for transport, I realized that we were returning to the values she'd tried to instill in me: community over isolation, authenticity over appearance, love over luxury. The Blackwood family's reaction to our move was predictably mixed. Harrison worried that James was downwardly mobile. Victoria suggested that we were reverse slumming. Caroline wondered aloud whether I was having some kind of delayed immigrant guilt complex. Only Patricia understood. She came to visit our new home the week after we moved in, bringing a housewarming gift that surprised me: a framed photograph of her father in his work clothes, standing proudly beside his plumbing truck. "I found this in my mother's things after she died," she explained. "I'd hidden it away because I was embarrassed, but looking at it now, I see a man who worked hard to provide for his family, who took pride in honest labor, who never forgot where he came from." She placed the photo on our mantelpiece, next to the picture of my grandmother in her dress shop. "I think they would have understood each other," she said. The months that followed brought a series of small revelations about what our life could be when freed from the pressure of maintaining appearances. James's work at the legal aid clinic introduced us to a community of professionals who had chosen meaning over money. Doctors who worked in community health centers, teachers who specialized in underserved populations, social workers who advocated for systemic change. For the first time since our marriage, I felt surrounded by people who shared our values rather than judging them. My grandmother's ring became a conversation piece in our new social circle, but for different reasons than it had been in James's family. Our friends were fascinated by the history behind it, the story of immigration and perseverance it represented, the wisdom of keeping valuable things hidden until the right moment to reveal them. "It's like a metaphor," said Maria, a friend who worked as a public defender. "All of us carry hidden value that the world doesn't always recognize. Sometimes we have to wait for the right moment to show people what we're really worth." The first-year anniversary of the infamous family dinner arrived on a crisp autumn evening.
James suggested we celebrate by having dinner at the same restaurant where I'd first told him about the ring's true value, not to commemorate the confrontation, but to mark how far we'd traveled since then. As we sat across from each other in the intimate bistro, I reflected on the changes the year had brought. James looked younger somehow, the stress lines around his eyes softened by work that fulfilled rather than drained him. Our conversation flowed easily, covering topics that mattered to both of us, rather than social obligations or family politics. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked as we shared dessert. "The decision to keep the ring, I mean. The money could have funded a lot of charitable work." I considered the question seriously. The $2 million could indeed have made a significant impact if donated wisely, but something told me my grandmother had intended a different kind of impact when she passed the ring to me. I don't regret it, but I think I understand now what she wanted me to do with it, which is use it as a teaching tool, a reminder that value isn't always visible, that assumptions can be dangerous, that the most precious things in life often come disguised as something ordinary. As if summoned by my words, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown. "This is Victoria. I hope you don't mind. I got your number from James. I wanted you to know that I've started volunteering at a women's shelter downtown. The work is hard but meaningful. I think your grandmother would have approved." I showed the message to James, who smiled. She's been different since that night, more thoughtful, less focused on appearances. "People can change," I replied, "when they're ready to see themselves clearly." "Even Caroline?" I laughed, thinking of James's younger sister, who had recently started dating a teacher despite her parents' subtle disapproval. Especially Caroline. She's been asking my advice about dating down, as she puts it. I told her there's no such thing as dating down when you're dating someone who shares your values. As we walked home through our neighborhood, past the small businesses and modest homes that had once seemed inadequate to James's family, I felt my grandmother's presence more strongly than ever. She had given me a ring that would always be valuable in monetary terms, but more importantly, she had given me the wisdom to recognize value in all its forms. The ring remained on my finger, where it belonged, a constant reminder that the most precious things in life, love, integrity, authenticity, family, cannot be bought or sold, only cherished and protected. And in our new life, built on foundation of shared values rather than inherited expectations, those were the only treasures that truly mattered. The final test came 2 years later, when Harrison Blackwood suffered a heart attack that forced him to confront his own mortality. During his recovery, he asked to meet with James and me privately, not in the formal setting of the family mansion, but in our modest townhouse. I served tea in my grandmother's china cups, delicate porcelain decorated with hand-painted flowers that had survived immigration, economic hardship, and decades of careful use. Harrison held his cup with unusual reverence, as if recognizing the stories it contained. "I've been thinking about legacy," he said, his voice still weak from his recent surgery. "What we leave behind, what we teach the next generation." "And what conclusions have you reached?" James asked. "That I've been focused on the wrong things. I built a successful business, accumulated substantial wealth, provided my family with every material advantage, but I failed to teach you what your grandfather taught me, that true success is measured by the positive impact you have on others." He set down his teacup and looked directly at me. "Your grandmother understood this. She built something meaningful with her dress shop, created beauty for others, provided for her family while never losing sight of what truly mattered." "She did," I agreed. He continued, "I want to make changes to the family foundation, to how we approach charitable giving, to the values we emphasize, but I need help from people who understand authentic generosity rather than tax-advantaged philanthropy." What followed was a year-long transformation for the Blackwood Family Foundation. Instead of writing large checks to established institutions, they began funding grassroots organizations that served underserved communities. Instead of attending charity galas for social networking, they began volunteering at soup kitchens and literacy centers. Patricia threw herself into the work with the passion of someone rediscovering her purpose. Victoria organized fundraisers for the women's shelter where she volunteered. Caroline started a scholarship program for first-generation college students. James used his legal skills to help the foundation navigate complex giving strategies that maximized impact rather than tax benefits. And I found myself serving as an informal advisor, helping them understand what authentic community engagement looked like. Through it all, my grandmother's ring remained on my finger, not as a symbol of hidden wealth, but as a reminder of the values that had guided this transformation. Occasionally, people would ask about its history, and I would tell them about Eleanor Chen, the immigrant woman who had built a business from nothing while never forgetting the importance of helping others. She gave me more than jewelry, I would explain. She gave me a way of seeing the world that recognized value in unexpected places. On the third anniversary of that memorable family dinner, the Blackwoods hosted a very different kind of gathering. Instead of a formal dinner party in their mansion, they organized a community barbecue in the park behind the literacy center where I volunteered. Families from all economic backgrounds mingled on picnic blankets, sharing food and stories while children played on the playground equipment the foundation had helped fund. Harrison, now fully recovered and visibly happier than I'd ever seen him, grilling hamburgers alongside former clients from James's legal aid clinic. "This is what family gatherings should look like," Patricia said, watching her granddaughter, Caroline's infant daughter, being passed from lap to lap by people who would have been strangers just a few years earlier. As the sun set over the park, I found myself standing next to the memorial garden we'd planted in honor of community members who had passed away. A small plaque bore my grandmother's name alongside others who had contributed to the neighborhood's character and strength. "She would have loved you," I replied, thinking of the man he'd become, someone who prioritized service over status, authenticity over appearance, love over luxury. "Do you think she knew?" he asked. "When she gave you the ring, do you think she knew it would lead to all this?" I touched the cashmere sapphire, feeling its familiar weight against my finger. In the gathering twilight, it looked like any other ring, simple, understated, unremarkable to casual observation. I think she knew that true treasures have a way of revealing themselves when the time is right, and that the most valuable things in life are often the ones that can't be bought or sold, only shared, cherished, and passed down through love. The ring had served its purpose, teaching us all that worth isn't measured by appearance, that assumptions can be dangerous, and that the most precious gifts often come disguised as something ordinary. But its greatest lesson was simpler still, that love, respect, and authenticity are the only currencies that truly matter. And in our family, both the one we were born into and the one we chose to create, those were the treasures we would always value most. If this story of hidden worth and quiet strength resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever been underestimated because of appearances? Have you discovered that the most valuable things in life often hide in plain sight? Share your experiences. Your story might inspire someone else to recognize their own hidden treasures. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding strength in unexpected places. And remember, true worth isn't always visible to the naked eye, but it's always visible to those who know how to look.